Hi, I'm Alex from acouplecooks.com, and this is our simplified guide to homemade sourdough bread. Alright, so homemade sourdough bread, it's pretty intimidating. You see pictures of it on Instagram and it looks great, but you don't know how to make it. We are here to simplify the process. It's not quick, it's not really easy, but it's pretty simple and you can do it at home. We're gonna show you everything you need to know. All right, so you're making homemade sourdough bread and you're like, why do I wanna bother? It's a lot of steps, a lot of work. Well, I'll tell you, it's this bread that is the reason to bother. You got a beautiful crispy crunch. When you open it up, you have a nice wide open crumb. It tastes really tangy, way better than any other bread you're gonna make at home. And you can do it yourself, it's cheap, it's pretty simple. We're gonna show you how. All right, before we get started with the actual steps, I'm gonna walk you through a few of the special tools you need. You're gonna need a Dutch oven. That's a soup pot that we actually bake the bread in, and it allows for a big crispy rise. It's like a bread oven that you just stick right inside your normal oven. You have a banneton. That's this basket here. You proof the bread in that overnight. We have this dough whisk and this lame, a razor blade. We use that for stirring the bread and for slicing the dough right before you put it in the oven. You don't really need these. You can just use a spoon and a knife, but it's handy to have the tools that work best. And we have two essential tools, a kitchen scale so you can weigh out all the ingredients. You can't be using a cup measure here, you have to weigh it. And a bench scraper that you use for flipping the dough over. To get a beautiful sourdough loaf like this, it's a 3-day process. Day one is really simple, it just takes a couple of minutes. You feed your sourdough starter. We have a whole video on feeding your starter. You can go watch that after this one. And then on day two, that's the big hands-on time. It takes about 5 hours total. You're waiting most of that time for the bread to proof, but there's a handful of steps in there that we'll walk you through. After you're done with that, you put it in the fridge overnight where it gets that tangy flavor. It ferments beautifully, and then you put it in the oven on day 3 and you get this beautiful sourdough loaf. So the first thing we have is this checklist here. So when you get ready to actually make the bread, you fill in these little bubbles as you go down the steps, and you're going to be able to follow the steps, not get lost. Pair that with this video and you'll be making bread in no time. All right, so we're on day 1 of the recipe. You take your sourdough starter, you have it here in a little container, and you throw out all but 1 tablespoon of the starter. Unfortunately, that's all you need to grow a new one. If you kept it, you're just gonna have way too much, so you don't need it. You can find other recipes for using that sourdough starter, but we recommend just discarding it, you'll have plenty. You add 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour, you stir it together, and you leave it on the counter overnight. This allows it to ferment, and the next morning, about 12 to 14 hours later, depending on your room temperature, you'll have an active bubbly starter that looks like this. We're on day 2 of the recipe. I'm still wearing the same clothes. I'm a bit dirty, but we're gonna be okay. So when you are about 12 hours after feeding that starter, you can check it out, and when you see some bubbles forming on the surface, you know you're good to go to start the recipe. You won't need the starter for another hour. Okay, the first step is to mix your flour and water, and then you just leave it to rest for an hour. This is called an autolyse, and it couldn't be simpler. You take 200 grams of all-purpose flour, 200 grams of bread flour, 50 grams of whole wheat flour. Give it a quick stir just to get those flours mixed up, and then add exactly 350 grams of water. You want to stir that together until you get a raggy dough and there's no dry flour. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just make sure there's not a big batch of dry flour in there. When all that dough has been incorporated, place the bowl inside of a plastic bag and wait 1 hour for it to rest. All right, so we let the dough sit there for an hour. Now we're ready to add the starter. Go ahead and add the 80 grams of sourdough. You stir it in, but don't have to worry about it being too perfect. It'll work its way through the dough throughout the day. Once you have the sourdough stirred in, go ahead and put it back in the plastic bag, and you want to place it into a warm area for proofing. Ideally, it'll be right at 80 degrees. You can see our link below for tips on how to get that perfect proofing area. We use an oven set to 80 degrees. All right, we've given the dough 30 minutes here for the sourdough to kind of get its feet going, and now we're gonna add the salt. You don't wanna add it too soon because it might stunt the growth of that sourdough a little bit. Now we're gonna add salt and mix that into the dough. The key here is to get your hands a little bit wet and move fast so that the dough doesn't stick to your hands. When you have the salt mixed in, go ahead and flip the dough over so that the seam side is facing down. Place the dough back in the plastic bag and back to the proofing area for another 30 minutes. Another 30 minutes have passed and we're ready to fold the dough. You're gonna follow these steps pretty carefully. It's gonna feel awkward at first, but you do it a few times and it's gonna be very natural. So for this fold, we go ahead and wet our hands again so the dough doesn't stick, and pick up each side of the dough and cross it across the middle. After that, you pick up the dough, wrap it around so you have a smooth top, and place the seam side down. Then place it back in the bag and into the warm spot to proof for 30 more minutes. We have another fold. You'll notice that the dough is a little bit stretchier and smoother than the previous time. After the fold, go ahead and put it back in the proofing area for 45 minutes. At this point, you should notice that your dough is becoming a lot silkier and smoother and a little bit bubbly. You can touch it and it feels a little bit like there's air in there. You want to be careful not to degas it too much. Don't press it down. When you do this fold, be really gentle. After folding it and flipping it over, this is the long proof, kind of our bulk fermentation. You let it sit for an hour and a half, and what you're looking for when it's done is for it to be kind of jiggly and bubbly at the top. You might want to go a little bit longer depending on your proofing situation, but you don't want to go too far or the dough will be really hard to shape. This dough looks perfect, it's ready to shape. I'm going to turn the dough out onto the counter and then lightly sprinkle it with flour so that the dough isn't tacky. You don't need it to be really well coated, just enough that you can touch it without getting stuck. Once you've floured the dough, grab the bench scraper and slowly pull the dough into a ball shape. You're trying to build tension on top without letting it tear. If you need to, you can add a little bit more flour so it doesn't get sticky. Let the bench scraper do all the work. Your hand is just there to guide the shape. Once the dough is nicely rounded, turn the bowl over on top of the dough and let it rest for 30 minutes. All right, we've made it for the final step of the day. It's gonna seem difficult, but it's actually pretty simple. Just watch the video a few times and you'll be able to nail it. So before we shape the dough, we're going to flour the banetone with a mixture of rice flour and all-purpose flour. This kind of acts like a Teflon and it lets the dough release really easily the next day. Sprinkle a little bit more all-purpose flour onto the dough, just enough so it's not tacky, but again, not too much. Use your bench scraper to flip over the dough. Shape it into a rough rectangle. You'll want to move quickly so that the hands don't stick to the dough, and then you're going to fold it up like an envelope. Rotate the dough 90 degrees and then very carefully roll it up without deflating all of the air. Sprinkle a little more flour onto it and pull it into a nice oval shape. You can pinch off any seams so that they close up for the bread. At this point, you can be a bit more generous with the flour. Make sure it's not tacky at all. Carefully turn the dough into the banetone and then pinch off any more seams that you see. And sprinkle just a little bit more flour on top. Place the banetone in a plastic bag and let it rest 30 minutes and then let it proof overnight in your refrigerator. All right, it's day 3. I still haven't had time to change my clothes, but we're gonna bake anyway. The first step is just to preheat your oven. You want to set it to 515 and place your Dutch oven inside with the lid on. It gets that Dutch oven really warm and it creates this beautiful bread oven inside. If your oven doesn't go up to 515, you can do it at 500, but the extra 15 degrees will give you a little bit more boost on your bread. After a 30-minute preheat, you're ready to bake your bread. When you remove the dough from the refrigerator, you want to slowly tug around the edges to make sure nothing is sticking, and you'll notice that it's gotten kind of smooth overnight. So take the banetone and flip it over onto the parchment paper, being really gentle and just coax it out with your fingers. You want to keep it as gentle as possible so that it doesn't get misshapen. So now's the fun part. You get to score the bread. You take your knife or your lame and you slice it at a slight angle all the way across, and then I like to add a few decorative scores as well. And then immediately and carefully put it into the Dutch oven and set the timer for 17 minutes. When the timer goes off, you have 3 things you have to get done without getting distracted. Take the Dutch oven out of the oven and put the bread straight on the rack. Reduce the temperature to 400 degrees. This will give you a perfect crust, and then set a new timer for 23 minutes. And that's a wrap. We have this beautiful bread. The hardest part now is just waiting that 45 minutes for it to cool off so that you can enjoy all your hard work. Make sure to check out our videos for growing your own starter and feeding your starter once you have a good one going. And for all of our sourdough tips, head over to acouplecooks.com. You can print off that checklist and you'll be baking in no time.